tons of shade for the insects that were around it. And also, did my microphone cut out or is it just me?
You're good.
All right, I'm loud enough. And then also,
Okay, I'm
it
gonna
still
have to shut
managed
this
to
door, you
reseed.
guys.
2 years of having a dog faceplant on top of it. Well, and then the other part of chaos of living organisms is something as exquisite as seeing a bee visiting a giant ironwood flower. Things grow and then they die. So this is some initial planting that we did in 2019. We were shooting for, as many people do when you're transitioning to natives, to have minimal irrigation. So that plant failed, that plant failed, that one failed, that one failed, and for some reason that we still don't understand, those succeeded. No clue. We planted them exact same time, they're the exact same thing, but yet some of them did. So there are things that we just can't control. We try to, as people who love gardening or enjoy landscaping. We want to be able to control it, but we just can't control everything, and we just have to be ready to accept that sometimes things will go kaput. So soil biology and watershed health. So this video is actually of a worm composting system that we put in on our property. And the worms allow us to not only break down our food scraps to turn it into very usable compost to put around our plants, but they also aerate the soil, and then they also transmit all of those great healthy microbes throughout the soil. So with very little effort on my part and just utilizing what nature can give us, you can manage to get really great tomato plants that give you a ridiculous number of tomatoes. Now, the second image over here, figure 14, is of a lovely nature preserve that is at the front of our neighborhood. As you can see, it's a retention pond slash, I don't know, boggy kind of area. You can see that the plants behind the water are more native, and then the ones in front are lawn. Cut short, heavily irrigated, heavily fertilized, and has tons of various other herbicides dumped on it. All of that goes into our water. People really don't fully understand that while that lawn might look exquisite and green and perfect, it comes with a price. And sometimes that's not a price that we're comfortable paying. So the next part of this is actually the session where I tell you all of my messes, and I have made so many messes. This is our first messy starting point, which is when our house is a new build, and because it's a new build, we had so much flooding and standing water because we are on fill dirt, which is quite honestly not the highest quality soil that's out there. We also had issues where our plot was misgraded. So that caused even more standing water and flooding. And then the last one, of course, is that the builder required that a St. Augustine sod only lawn be put in. We requested that they not put in lawn. We requested that they put anything else but St. Augustine down. We just can't get them to change everything, right? Now, granted, if we had more homeowners who requested it of their builders, maybe the builders would start shifting that up and giving you more options. But the way it was set up is that our contract required St. Augustine and St. Augustine only. So this is 2019. This is a year and a half or so after we built the house. And as you can see, it is a house that is still standing, which is great. It's also a house that did not have gutters, which we didn't expect. That was very surprising, and the fact that there's no gutters meant that we had to divert a lot of the money that we were going to put into our landscaping into putting rock. So we have rock, a whole foot of rock all the way around our house. And the whole reason why we did that is we needed to reduce the erosion and also keep that water away from our foundation, and that was the only way we could think of to do it. But because of the rock, we then ended up with way too much lawn and also a lot of rock burnt plants. So obviously that balance is not right. We had to change something. So I'm a researcher. I like research. It makes me very happy. So this is my literature work that I did. The first main person that I started to look at and really read up, not only the books, but also the papers that he's done, is Doug Tallamy. And the reason is he's an entomologist who was the first person to really study and publish work that showed the very close associations that were necessary in order to keep insect and wildlife populations alive if you had native versus non-native plantings. So I really appreciated learning more about why I needed more natives, right? While the hibiscus might be very pretty and whatever the other plants are and the sod might look really nice, it's just not as useful. So what can I do to really help all of the insects and animals around us? So then once I realized that that is what I wanted to do, I wanted to prioritize taking care of the environment as a whole. I looked into Ginny Stibbolt and Marjorie Shropshire's work, and theirs was really valuable to me because it gave me an understanding of what a multi-tiered planting system looks like. And what I mean by that is in this particular image, you can see that they have created, they've created different levels of planting. So you've got something that's large, like a magnolia. You have shrubs that go around it of varying heights, and then you have a ground cover. But then the other part of this particular pyramid is when this design was created, it also provided multiple nesting sources and multiple food sources, not only for the insects and the animals, but also for the humans, which is really cool. So I would suggest that if anybody wanted to take a look at more of these kind of tiered systems, that they take a look at Marjorie Shropshire and Ginny Stibbolt's work. So then we also went to a few locations. One of them was we went to Rockledge Gardens. And that's because I know nothing, after, as you can imagine, after living in Arizona, I knew nothing about how to make anything grow. And I also didn't know why things grew so well here. I mean, humidity and, temperature, those parts I understand. But what is it that made the soil here so rich as to be able to provide so many different types of natives for people to choose from? So Rockledge Garden helped us figure that out. And the other thing that I like to do is eat. So my garden, my backyard, has non-natives that are primarily food. So I needed to know which food plants I had to put in that, first of all, I would want to eat, and second of all, would be possible to have on our particular piece of land, considering the restrictions of size, irrigation, and then, of course, most importantly, which were the easiest to maintain. As you can tell, I'm a very lazy individual, just in general. I just don't want to do as much maintenance or as little maintenance as possible. So the other place we went to were actually multiple native plant nurseries. And the reason why we went to different ones and then also at different points of time is primarily because one of the complaints that I've heard a lot from people is that they think that natives look scrubby, right? That there's not a lot of very beautiful fullness towards a native. And they're not completely wrong. Depending on the season, depending on how many plants you've put down in that particular space and what the growing conditions are like, you can get stuff that looks like you shoved a bunch of sticks in the ground with a few flowers at the end of it. So We went multiple times to these the native plant nurseries so that I could see what it looked like when I had 15 of one particular plant, right? A massing of that plant versus one. Did I like it that way? Did I really appreciate the sculptural quality that it gave me if I just had a single? Or did I need to see that mass in order for me to feel like it was growing well? So the nurseries were really handy to be able to understand what I wanted and what would do well for a landscape. Oh, this came out crappier than I thought. Sorry, I apologize for the slide. So we used experts, and our experts were from Change of Greenery. And the reason why is this is actually a picture of a giant easel board image of me attempting to put all the plants I wanted on one page. It's a mess. Many of those plants are terrible to plant at the same time. Other of those plants are not ones that would do well on our property. I put down everything. I mean, it's practically its own grocery store. So I needed somebody that could understand my brand of crazy, which is I want to eat, and oh, by the way, I also want to have tons of natives. So put everything down all at once. The other thing I needed is somebody that could synthesize ideas with me and that could understand that I needed a tiered multi-year approach because we just don't have the budget to be able to put in everything all at once. Also, the other part of it is one thing that I learned from talking to a lot of the native plant nursery workers is one of the things they really pointed out is, guess what? You're never entirely sure how those plants are going to do, right? So give them time. See what they do. See if they like the location. See if they fill out or don't. And that made me realize that I wanted to have a multi-year approach. And then the biggest one for me was I needed somebody that was really dedicated to maintaining the soil biome and the waterways. So this is a very important slide. It's called Making Nice with Your Neighbors. Also known as what happens if you're the first one who's trying native landscaping. So if you are in an HOA, well, even if you're not, know your legal hammers. Know your regulations, know your watershed requirements. That will be later on in this presentation. Also, if you are putting in a proposal, submitting a proposal, try and create as much documentation as possible. Give them more information than they're asking for because you're presenting essentially a full plate of food and not showing them the grocery bags that you would use to make that food, right? So the more information you give, the prettier the pictures, the more that you pay in order to get the surveyors to survey things properly. It sucks, and I completely understand that, but it does pay off. It makes things a lot easier because HOAs are bureaucratic, right? It's gonna take them time to be able to crank through anything, and the more information you give them that provides a more expansive picture of what you're shooting for, the easier it is for people to be able to move it through their bureaucracy. If you can, also attend your meetings and talk about your natives. I will give you more information about that in section 4E. And try and keep your landscaping as neat and bordered as possible in your front yard or in the area that's easy to see from the street. That's one of the major requirements that a lot of HOAs want from their homeowners, is they want everything to look pristine. Well, my stuff might be a little scrubby, but I can really make it look nice, right? Put a pretty border around it, put down some mulch that looks good, maybe do the mass of plantings that we were talking about earlier to make it look more full. And then in the back, where people can't see it, just let it reseed and do whatever you want back there. Also, remember to protect your own property line. We cannot require that our neighbors stop spraying. However, we can make it very clear that that spray doesn't need to be on our property. You can request it very nicely of your neighbors, and a lot of them will then be able to talk to their, either they stop spraying over your property line, or they'll talk to their contractors and make sure that their contractors acknowledge that. And if you can, offer free seedlings. That's what I do, is I offer seedlings for everything that I have on my property, and anybody who comes to my property, if they're just dropping in for wine and a chat, or if they want to come and play with the dog, they sit down, and if they say that they think something looks pretty, oh, that's a really pretty flower, would you like a seedling? I can get one for you, give me a month or two, or whatever I need, and I try and provide those for free. So with your regulations, okay, please read everything that they provide you. You are going to have covenants, sometimes they're known as CCRs, and this is really, really important. These regulations might seem as if they are at cross purposes, which is why you then talk to your board members or to your subcommittee members about exactly what it is that these covenants are talking about, right? One part of your HOA covenants could say that you're not supposed to have anything but St. Augustine in the front yard. The second part of your covenant says that you just have to have your lawn maintained and cut at a certain height. Well, great. Which one of those is actually true? Because I can keep my ground covers cut and maintained at a certain height, or do I have to have St. Augustine? Only way you can get that answer is if you talk to your board members, talk to the people that should know more about this covenants. Now, the last part I want to say about this is ask them for ideas on how to present your proposals to the board or your HOA subcommittees, whatever it might be, right? Do not ask them about the natives themselves, because their opinion will be, it's going to look terrible, it's going to look weedy, it's not going to be what we want. Instead, ask them, well, do you guys like to see things that are bordered in cement? Are you okay if we put a nice stacked stone border? Those are the questions that they like, because then it says, okay, this person is interested in how it's going to present to the street. For some reason, that's very important to HOAs. I'm not entirely sure why. Personally, it's more important to me of whether or not I can eat from whatever's in the street. So, policy. By the way, this is all, a few of these slides are on your handouts. This one is on your handout, and also I think the presentation will be made available online so that you can just click through. These are all hyperlinks, but essentially the Florida Friendly Statute says that landscaping that is called Florida or deemed Florida Friendly cannot be completely blocked by an HOA. Their definition of Florida Friendly, however, doesn't require that it's a native plant. It just says that it's something that is drought tolerant, that's adaptable to local conditions. So a lot of people might put in something that's not native. But does that actually work with what you want to have in your own landscape? The other place that you should be, or the other two places that you should be paying attention to with respect to policy, right? So that's a Florida state statute, but the St. Johns River Water Management as well as the Florida Native Plant Society will both give you specifics, and they will actually explain a little bit more about what those statutes might look like when they're applied to you as a homeowner, okay? So the statutes look really impressive, but I personally use FNPS, the Native Plant Society, in order to understand exactly what the legislative bodies have chosen to do with my backyard. Okay, this is a white paper that I wrote on native plants, and I presented this to my HOA. In this white paper, it's just a quick little summary of plants that I thought would be useful at particular locations in our subdivision. It was relatively simple to do. All of those images actually came from the Florida Native Plant Society webpage, but I just pulled together a couple of them, and I was able to present this. It was actually a much longer white paper, and I think we'll also be making that white paper available online, if I'm correct. So it was just a bunch of images, and it gave my HOA, the board, a chance to look at something and to say, oh, this is what this plant will look like when it's full grown. Look at how lovely the flowers are. And then I could emphasize, this is how big it gets, these are the colors, this is the amount of irrigation, and this is the amount of fertilizer necessary. And I could also give them a little bit of an estimate in terms of what the costs might be. Now, the cost part is not something that a lot of people can add to their white paper. However, by this point in time, I was actually on the Architectural Review Committee. I was the chair of the Architectural Review Committee for my subdivision. So I knew a little bit about how much they were spending on maintaining these locations. And so I could make a very nice table and say, look, your fertilizer costs will be 0. Irrigation costs will be minimal, maybe non-zero in the drier months. Numbers always talk, and so do pretty pictures. But let me tell you a little bit more about what happened once we started really making our messes. So we had 3 major goals. One of the goals was to improve drainage. Another goal was to support the soil ecosystem. And then the last goal was to make sure that I had companion plants. The first 2 are somewhat, I think we've talked about a little bit, but the last one is not something that a lot of people needed to do if they have in a native-only landscape. Because our landscape included non-native food trees, I made sure that the plants that were nearby or underneath a fruit tree, for example, like a mango, would be ones that would improve nitrogen fixation or allow for nitrogen fixation in the soil. And that would allow for a lot of pollinators to be nearby, because I don't get a mango unless the soil is healthy, the plant is healthy, and I have everything pollinated properly. Okay, this is my very first attempt. This was back in 2019 to make a mess in our landscape. So this is actually what I gave as my proposal. I mean, I did a little write-up also, but this was a good part of my proposal. One of them was change of greenery, actually on the left-hand side. Nope, right-hand side, sorry. On the right-hand side, you can see an image of that's photoshopped. So they actually took the ideas that we had for all the various plants, and they said, this is what it would actually look if we planted it, right? Which is extremely handy. But then on the left-hand side, you can see that there's a bird's eye view of that same proposed install. So this gives people an idea of how big that particular tree might look, right? And the fact that we'll be layering it like this, so it'll be up and down and up and down. It's really handy to have that bird's eye view. Now, we were rejected, completely denied. And the reason was, which is a very good reason, is that the area between our sidewalk and our street doesn't actually belong to the homeowner. We're supposed to maintain it, but we can't actually plant anything there, according to the CCRs, which is our covenants. I thought I had read it. I did not ask people whether I had read it properly. And so we had to actually do a resubmission. And in that resubmission, all we did is we took those plants and we shoved them on the other side of the sidewalk. And magically, it worked. One thing I will point out, depending on how your HOA stores its records, I actually resubmitted with a black and white image of the bird's eye view. The reason is, sometimes the black and white images are easier to scan in because our HOA scans in all of its paperwork and then the papers are recycled. So I wanted to make sure that if somebody came back and looked at my proposal, that they would be able to understand exactly what I'm talking about, and if the scanning was poor, they might not be able to do that. So I submitted it in black and white. One thing I also put down here is, as I was talking about, we gave more details than necessary. I actually told them exactly what was going to be on the ground within each of these beds. So in the front, for example, we had crushed coquina shell. We also had some pine bark mulch in the back, and we also had rock going around the house. I gave them all of that information. And so because our proposal was accepted, we were able to start the real mess, which is this prep work, where they pulled out the back part of our property actually is on a pretty steep slope. So what I did is the flat part, I kind of kept the way it was, but I ripped out all the grass that was on that slope all the way down. So that's almost a good half, maybe 2/3 of our backyard is we ripped out all that grass. We put in proper drainage, which was French drains in some places, because we also installed gutters because the amount of water that was coming off was ridiculous. And then we also mulched very, very heavily. Now the results are that by using natives to improve drainage, we were able to minimize our standing water. We also broke up compacted soil, which is all that's the nasty fill dirt that they had put down in the first place. We provided lots of plants for pollination, and most importantly, we had over 3.5 inches of pine bark nuggets or chips, whatever you want to call them, put down in our backyard on that back slope. 3.5 inches. That provides a lot of great organic matter for our soil and was the only reason why I think we were able to get things to grow. So we have an image over here of goldenrod flower with a native sweat bee on it. Sweat bees are amazing because they kind of glisten in, or they're a little bit iridescent in the green shades. We also have a wild coffee plant. There's an image of a gopher tortoise. And then one of the things that we did is we removed a bunch of invasives. And that's the image on the right-hand most side. So we pulled out even more invasives that were in the back preserve area near us because we wanted to make sure that those invasives didn't come over onto our property. We also added a bunch of screening plants and boundary plants that were native. In our case, they were wax myrtles. And as you can see, we had a bunch of new beds that we're filling up with plants. Now this is less than 1 year after planting, right? These pictures were all within 6 to 8 months of ripping out all that sod and putting in new plants. So we were really, really happy with it, with our results. So our next mess that we made was we wanted to have or improve as much ADA compliant access as possible to our yard and to our house. So we wanted to also give ourselves ADA compliant raised bed gardening options and support sensitive plants with shade and screening. So this mess that we made was to put in an ADA compliant sidewalk and patio expansion as well as stairs. So that patio was also, it's under a screen or pool, what we commonly think of as a pool cage. So this is the result of that particular set of messes. As you can see, it's a sidewalk, it exists. In our case, it's 4 feet wide, so that's wide enough for motorized wheelchairs to be able to travel safely across it. We also put in our staircases, and they are large and shallow. And the reason we did that is that you can actually, they're sized so that you can drop a walker in front of you, lock it into position, and step down. So that step down is as short as we could possibly make it. So we put in a lot more stairs in that we actually have multiple stairs going down, because we wanted to make sure that if you were with a walker, you didn't have to make a giant leap or a big drop if you have, went too far. If you were trying to step down. And then the ADA compliant raised bed, we did one that is H-shaped. It also is, the edges are about 3 feet off the ground, and we removed everything that's within that H so that we actually touch the soil underneath. So anything that I add, whether it be new plants, compost, right? All of those new soil, all of it ends up interacting with the soil that we already have. So my earthworms, they get to work their way all the way down to the very bottom, and they bring all of those microbes up and down, and it helps maintain the health of my plants without me having to do too much. So we thought we were doing pretty spiffy. And so the next year, we decided we were going to get a dog. Well, that dog meant that we had to put in a fence. And in the process, we did a bunch of more landscaping, because I love the excuse to do landscaping. What we did is we removed any pet hostile plantings. We were getting a puppy specifically, so we knew that puppy would most likely put everything in its mouth, just like a kid would. We wanted to make sure that it did not poison itself, just like you're supposed to keep your kids alive. So the fence that we created, or that we had put in, we also wanted to keep the pet in, but we wanted to allow access to smaller animals that might be in the area. So for us, what that means is we did two major things. First of all, any of the holes that were dug underneath our fence, we don't fill them in. We allow them to stay, because we want any animal that's able to come into our yard to feel that it can escape freely if necessary. Because the second thing that we did is we also trained our pet to stop at the fence. Even though those holes exist, and some of them are quite sizable, because we actually have a gopher tortoise that lives right behind our property and sometimes nests on our property. Our dog is trained not to go down those particular holes, so she might be curious about it, but she doesn't actually, and she's curious about the animals that come to visit. But we also trained her to come as soon as she was called, specifically so that she understands that she can alert us to an animal, but she's not supposed to interact with it. The joke is that she's very food driven, so we just provide large amounts of treats. So now she alerts us to the snake and then runs straight into the house because she knows she's going to get a giant treat. It's pretty amusing to watch. But the last thing that we also did is we wanted to update the plantings, because we had some things that were extremely successful, too successful, and we needed to winnow it down, or things that were not useful. And one of those examples is a lot of sugar cane. We put in a ton of sugar cane, and we just weren't eating it. So we did decide that, for example, we had to pull out the sugar cane. But this is the result of our updated plantings. We have some seaside gentian that's showing up. The middle top is coral honeysuckle. On the right-hand side is fakahachi grass that's flanking scorpion tail and native lantana. The bottom right-hand side is our frontmost bed looks like a meadow, in that we have grasses to anchor it, and we've allowed the wildflowers to fill in and come up and die off as they do seasonally. The middle bottom is a rosinweed, and then we have Stokes asters, the very pretty purple one, on the left-hand side. So we also had, because our mess was so extensive, we were able to put in some wax myrtle, muhly grass, rattlesnake master in our air conditioning bed, because that helps deal with the excess water that often comes out of an air conditioner. All of those plants suck it up and keep us from having flooding issues. We also, figure 32 is scarlet sage growing along the side, right beside the house, between the house and the sidewalk. We also had some love grass in there, and then we put in false rosemary to kind of spill out over onto the sidewalk. Now, figure 33 is really cool, and the reason is those are almost the same image, but they are 2.5 months apart. So the one that is on the left-hand most side is actually partridge pea. And those plants, we only put in one plant to start, and it reseeded very enthusiastically, as partridge pea has a tendency to do. And we kept it that way. I mean, obviously, we pulled out ones that were just going nuts. But we kept it that way and ended up with this glorious, screening, almost like somebody had put in a hedge of just beautiful yellow flowers with honeybees and giant carpenter bees tumbling out of the flowers because they were so drunk on the pollen. Then 2.5 months later, though, those partridge peas have died off, and my black-eyed Susans have come up in almost the same exact location. So using native plants and allowing them to be seasonal works really, really well if that planting is, like we have up here in the front yard, bordered, right? So I did a mass planting of the partridge pea and then allowed it to come out and then allowed the next flowers to come up. So it's a different height, it's a different look. It looks as if I replanted my entire yard and all I did was let them live. Now these are the messes in the rear. And the really fun one, ooh, this might be a little loud. Can we bring the volume down on the video? This is our resident gopher tortoise. And what's really cool is I am sitting on the stairs and videoing this from less than 6 inches away at some points as he passes me. And it was just going along and chomping, enjoying itself, and snacking on all of the various plants that we've put down and also the ones that have volunteered into our backyard. So in the back, we have wild petunia near the staircase on the left-hand side. We've got wild petunia and frog fruit that is encircling each of the bars of the staircase as you go all the way down. We have a native magnolia with scarlet sage popping up underneath it. We have what, honestly, I don't even remember what in the world this thing is, and I did not plant it. It was a volunteer, and I don't know what that is, but it's glorious. And I love how sculptural it looks, so I let it go. I know it's native of something, but heck if I can remember what it is. And then the last image is actually a spiderwort plant with sunshine mimosa coming up underneath it. By the way, does anybody know what that third image from the left might be? No idea? All right, well, if anybody knows, please feel free to email me or at a later point in time. Because it's, magical. It's magical how you don't know what's going to happen anytime you step out your front or backyard. Okay, so that brings us to our present. Now, I will also say one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning of my talk. We have kept and maintained a completely organic backyard. Part of it being organic is also we have what's commonly known as a freedom lawn, which is we allowed our St. Augustine to die off as much as possible, and actually ripped out some when I could figure out what it was. And we allowed native plants to take over. So we have what looks like a lawn to most people, but is actually all native ground cover. And that's really neat, because also, I didn't plant a lot of those. They're just ones that the birds dropped or that my dog brought seeds of in, and all of a sudden I have flowers and leaves and things popping up, and anyway. So this is our present. Our present is quite literally, how do you compost better? Can I make my own compost? So what we use is we tried to improve the dirt as much as we possibly could. The way we did that is with a anaerobic bokashi system. We use the urban composter, and the urban composter allows you to pretty much compost everything, including fats and oils, in even small bones. Because it's an anaerobic system, you don't have to worry about having, essentially what you're doing is you're fermenting. You pop it open, you don't have any, what you think of as the kind of the rotting smells. Instead, you smell something that smells a little bit like lemon juice. Sometimes it smells a little like sauerkraut. It's fermenting, right? It's very natural, so there's very minimal smell that comes from this particular composting method. The other advantage is because it's an anaerobic thing, what we're doing is we're breaking everything down, and then I move it to our worm composting, because our worms then finish the job, right? Whatever the insects are, whatever exists out there or wants to grow, then comes in to our sub-pod system, which is my worm composting system. It's actually placed in the ground. So, and then in the middle, you put in your scraps, or in our case, we use the pieces that we've already partially composted. The worms or whatever insects chew that up. They then go through the soil and aerate the soil and transmit all those microbes around, and I get compost, which I then put around my plants. So it's a really nice cycle that we've set up for ourselves that makes me feel a little better about improving our soil health. Well, and the other project that we put in this year, the big mess, giant mess, is we put in a rainwater capture system. Ours is, the product is the Aquascape system, and ours was installed by Florida Custom Aquatics. And what the Aquascape system allows you to do is you can put it's not a cistern per se, but you can put a water capture system underneath anything that's permeable. So that could be soil, that could be pavers, if your pavers are more permeable than most. That could be, you know, anything you possibly could dream of. In our case, it's a stream. It's a circulating stream. And what it allows us to do is it captures the rainwater that percolates through. It also captures the rainwater because we hooked ours up to a gutter, and then it pumps it back out and creates this. So we have a natural stream that's only about 2.5 feet tall, but it winds its way along the side of our house. This image is the stream that's been planted with native plants. We have creeping sage, Elliott's lovegrass, Leavenworth tickseed, Stokes aster, and rayless sunflower that are all planted around that stream. And behind it, you can see there's a little bit of purple, and that's our beautyberry that was already established. And behind that is our coconut trees. And beside it is actually bananas. So as you can see, this is my layering technique, right? I want things to go vertical, I want things to go horizontal, but most importantly, I want things that can feed back onto themselves. So this system is a 240-gallon pondless waterfall. And what's really cool is I have a second pump that I can use to turn on a spigot, so I can irrigate anything I want with those 240 gallons. It's really, really cool to see. So yeah, it's tied to my gutters. I don't put any water in it. It keeps on going. The only thing I do is pay a little bit for electricity. And the coolest part about it is because it is water that is moving constantly, you don't have to worry about mosquitoes. So there's no dunks of any sort. You may get a few frogs because it might be really cool for them. You get various insects coming to visit, whether that be your dragonflies that are curious about the area, or your butterflies that are coming to sip from the edges of the damp rocks. And you get a bunch of animals that are coming over so they can take a drink. So it's been a lot of fun, that's what I'll say. So the big thing to look at is what does all of this really come down to, right? So in our case, we ended up having to do professional installation for everything, where we're not in a position to be able to do that work ourselves. So please understand that everything that you saw from the point that the house was built was all professionally installed. I think if you did your own installation, you could drop the prices by a third, maybe even as much as a half. But this is where we come out to. Okay, so 2019, we did primarily landscaping. The approximate cost of that was about $12,000. And that included, like I said, vast amounts of mulch, ripping up lawn, as well as the planting. 2020, we recovered and we wanted to give ourselves time to see what the plants were doing before we moved to the next step. We put our sidewalk and patio expansion in. It's very, very large because we had staircases, we have a sidewalk that wraps around our house, and we had a very large patio. So please remember that that's one of the reasons why that cost is much, much higher. We put in a fence the next year, and then we started doing composting. Granted, the composting was like the cheapest of all of it, but it did cost a little bit to get those pieces. And this last year, we did our rainwater capture system. So it was not cheap. However, because we did it in a multi-year, in a phased manner, we were able to keep it into something that was somewhat reasonable and within a budget that we were comfortable working with each of those years. For us, it was priceless. So here are all of the references for those of you that like to have lots of references. Like I said, because this will be available online, you can just click. You should have a number of these references on the back of your handout also. But this is the literature. These are the links to Ginny Stibbolt and Marjorie Shropshire's information, as well as their books that they have published. This is Doug Talamy with his information, and then also the main books that he has published. I didn't include any of his papers because sometimes you have to have university access to get a few of those. And then these are all, 8C is all of our vendors that we have used and links to their websites. So at the end, so I would like to say thank you very quickly to Skip, Aaron, and Olive from Change of Greenery, Brad and Adam from Florida Custom Aquatics, and from, of course, Jane and Linda from Conradina chapter, and most especially to my husband, Anton, for putting up with me all these years. So I am happy to take any and all questions you might have at this time.
First, I want to say thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
I know everyone's really looking forward to seeing her home on the tour. It is spectacular.
Thank you.
And the one thing that I forgot to mention up front is 5 out of the 6 homes on the tour this year are in HOAs. So that's a rare thing we put together. Saumya's is awesome, but there are some other awesome ones on the tour as well. So we can open it up to questions. Did everyone get a handout? I want to make sure you got that valuable piece of information.
Okay. Yes.
Well, now that the upfront cost,
Right.
very informative. So what do you think your maintenance cost is going to be?
Maintenance cost. So now remember, we do have fruit trees, for example, on our property, food kind of things. Maintenance cost.
So you got everything in place. It sounds like you'll have very little.
Yeah, I would say maybe $500 to $1,000 a year, and that includes extra soil for my, or extra compost for my raised bed. But I'd say maybe 500 to 1,000, because quite honestly, because we don't use fertilizer and we don't use herbicides, a large part of that has gone away. Now, I will say also one other thing is we do have, our irrigation is tied to our well, right? So while we do minimal irrigation, the water at least is not coming from city sources. So that is one thing that allows us to have it a little cheaper. But yeah, because we now have the system that we've got the big fruit trees, we've got the supporting companion plants around them that are mostly, if not all, natives. We've got ground cover. I really don't think it's going to be that much more
Sounds
expensive.
like also you reduce the cost from your HOA,
Yes,
so you don't have to raise the fees to maintain.
for our property, that's true. It is something that I would like to be able to have that happen for every property, but
That could be an incentive for your HOA to get behind other people to do the same thing you did.
yes, yes. And that's kind of what I'm hoping our neighbors have been seeing all these years. So one of the reasons why I keep on offering seedlings is for this reason. Because if they plant a little stand of muley grass because they think it looks pretty, well, the advantage is maybe more and other people will realize how precious it is to have lower costs in terms of maintenance costs. So
And also resell, if you would ever resell your house, that would be a plus.
I would think so. I would hope so, yes. Any other questions? Yes.
I didn't hear you mention what square footage or area you're working with.
Oh,
Could you repeat the question for the?
yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. So yes, the question was, what is the square footage or the acreage that we're working with? I am correct. I think we're on a 1/4 acre. So to us, it seems like a giant piece of property, but it also has a house on a majority of it. But yeah, so a 1/4 acre. We've managed to do quite a lot of plants and plantings, even on that 1/4 acre. So. So the question was whether or not I back up to a preserve. So I don't back up to a preserve. Well, that is a point of contention. I'm supposed to be backing up to an area of land that is owned by another subdivision, and that's supposed to be their common area or preserve area. However, that HOA is, and that subdivision is much older. So they've been there for 20, 25 years. So they don't necessarily, I'll just put it like this, people have knocked down their fence lines and put in new fences in different places. So in our subdivision, we do have preserve areas near us, and we are located close to Wickham Park. So in my backyard, I have, even with the fence, we have armadillo, we have raccoon, squirrels, of course, bunny rabbits galore. We've got snakes, we've got possums, we've got the gopher tortoises. We have hawks, owls, tons of birds, and as many insects as you could possibly name. Oh, that would be supported, of course, on my plants. But we do have a lot of preserved property that's owned by our HOA, which is another reason why I put forth the white paper to try and get our HOA to even put in more native plants on the preserved property to give those animals and insects a place to live. So it's a great question. Can I take the question beside you? Yes.
When you put in the cistern, did they have to dig up and destroy a lot of the plantings you'd already done?
That's a really nice question. I should have added a picture of what the plantings look like beforehand. So the question is, when we put in the rainwater capture system, whether we had to destroy a lot of plantings that I had already done. And actually, the area that we chose to do it in only had freedom lawn. So there was some sunshine mimosa, some frog fruit that had grown into that area. Then some tick seed and a few other ones that are easily mowed, but it was a relatively empty spot, and that's one of the reasons why we chose it. The other reason, of course, is that it was close to electricity because we require a plug point to run the pump, and close to a gutter. So those were that was essentially what we ended up with. We were very lucky that we didn't have to pull out a bunch of trees and stuff. Weirdly enough, it's extremely picturesque, and that was completely by our mistake. We did not plan for it to look as beautiful as it does, and that lends itself more to the individuals that put it in and less to me. So in my choices. And yes, there's a question in the back.
So I was just curious about your HOA. Did they adopt some of the native plantings that you suggested in your white paper?
Okay, yes. So the question is whether the HOA has adopted those native plants that I suggested in my white paper. And unfortunately, they did not do it to the extent that I would have liked. What they did do is we had some common areas that had to be replanted, and because, so I don't know how many of you know this, but I did not know this. The St. John's River or St. John's Water River Management System actually links towards your HOA, not to a homeowner. So as a homeowner, I can call and ask them a question, but they won't come onto my property to see if my property is helping to maintain the waterways. But they will come to an HOA to see if the HOA is doing what they're supposed to in the common kind of general areas. So unfortunately, our builder had crossed property lines and put in and ripped up way too much native plantings and put down sod for some of the homes. So when St. John's came in, they actually said, hey, you guys need to replant all of this. A majority of those plants came from our backyard. We offered them for free to the HOA, and the HOA was able to replant with that and thereby drop the costs that they themselves had to accrue in order to make St. John's a little happier. So, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, question here.
How long did it take for all of your ground cover to grow in, including where you planted? So you said you started planting and then it volunteered.
Yes. So the Freedom Lawn area is specifically what you're asking for, right? So I want to say, I would say it took in about 1.5 years to fully grow in. And the reason it took so long is at the same time the St. Augustine was dying off, right? So it was a question for some of those native plants, they just had to wait. Because to be honest, ripping out sod is kind of expensive. And so my vote was just, I was gonna stop irrigating it and I was gonna stop fertilizing it and stop doing everything to it and just let it go. And so the St. Augustine took its own time to die off, and then thereby the plants had to take, to fight for supremacy a little bit as the St. Augustine was dying off. But 1.5 years, and then it's completely native now. So it has been a joy, to say the least. Thank you. I hope you guys like it when you come to the property. Oh, yes.
I see that you're in a gated community. How do we get in?
So the day of the tour, the gates will be open for the entire tour time, so people can come and go freely.
Homeowner in your area.
I'm sorry?
I think there's another homeowner also on the tour. Around the corner from you.
No, I don't think so. Close by, but not in the same subdivision. Yes, very close. Was there another? Yes. Composting system? Yeah. Yeah, it's really cool. So the question is, my worm, sorry, I forgot to mention my questions all this time. The question was, the worm composting system, how exactly did it work? And mine is in the ground. So the way it works is, for some reason, I use Xerox boxes. So people who don't understand what a Xerox box looks like, come to me later and I'll explain it. But a Xerox box, it's about the size of a Xerox box. And what they've done is they've essentially created a giant plastic cube. And the top, I'd say, quarter of it has little holes all the way around. And that's actually for ventilation, to allow for nice airflow, but to keep out the flies, for example, but still allow any smells that might be coming in to dissipate. Then the sides, the rest of the sides are actually made up of different size holes, just kind of distributed all the way around somewhat randomly. And the reason why it's in the ground is what you do is you drop it into the ground so that the air holes are sitting right above your soil line. And all of those bigger holes that are beneath the ground allow your insects to come and go freely. So on the video, we lifted up we opened it up and then we lifted up the mat that I used to cover the scraps as they're composting. And that mat had a bunch of earthworms on it. Well, you can't really see it. You'd have to watch the video maybe on your own personal screen. But there are worms that are going in the holes. They're hiding back into the holes and burrowing into the soil that's surrounding the sub pod. So that system, the reason why I wanted it is, like I said, I'm really lazy. So the sub pod system allows me to, first of all, I don't have to control the temperature that my worms are experiencing, because if it's too hot, they have the rest of the soil around them to go deeper in where it's nice and cool. If it's too cold, they come up closer to the soil. I don't have to do anything. The other part of this is a lot of the worm systems that I'd seen also require you to maintain certain humidity or certain soil, like wetness, essentially. I don't have to do that. In the same way, if the soil is too dry, my worms go down towards the ground where there's more moisture being held in that organic matter. If it's too wet, they come up where they might be a little bit damp, but at least the organic matter that's sucked in all of that water is holding it lower down.
So do you put your compost in there?
You compost inside of it. So you lift up the lid, you pull back your mat, you dump your scraps, and then they have essentially what looks like an auger to kind of mix it all up. And then you try and mix it up with, a little bit of some brown material in addition to all of your scraps. You cover it back up, maybe water the mat a little bit so it's nice and damp and cool and comfortable. And you close it, and then you can sit on it, walk on it, do whatever you need. And then you're all done. You come back a little bit later and add more. So.
And how do you gather the compost then? How do you harvest the compost?
How do you harvest the compost? Okay, so the question is, how do you harvest the compost from within a sub pod? You pop open the lid, pull back the mat, and then using either a small trowel of some sort or your hands, if you'd like to, you just scoop out whatever's in there, and then you put it around. And if you're doing, so in our case, most of that compost is currently being used on the plants that we have in that raised bed area. Our raised bed is about 14 by 10 feet. So all of those plants get the compost from within the sub pod. So what I do is I reach in and I scoop up a trowelful and I toss. And any worms or insects that were in that compost just go back into my soil. And I just repeat that until it's relatively empty. And then I add a little bit more brown material. In my case, to start, I usually use a little moistened coconut coir because that holds water really well and maintains moisture really nicely for the worms. And then add my next batch of scraps.
When you
Yes.
started the composting, did you have to seed it with earthworms?
So the question is whether or not you had to, when you start composting in the worm composting system, if you had to seed with earthworms. And we did. Part of that reason is that bed I told you about, that's 3 feet deep, it is open to the ground, right? Because I wanted to make sure that I didn't have to worry about water systems and so on and so forth. However, from that point, I started layering in cardboard, vegetative matter from our plants or trees that we were cutting back, and scraps, food scraps, and built all of that up. So maybe the top foot is soil that we added, but the other 2 feet is soil that I created just by throwing in branches, covering it with cardboard, letting it break down, right, in that area. So I already had composting insects of various types, including worms, but they were not necessarily composting earthworms. So what I chose to do is when we started the sub pod, I put in, and you buy a bag, and they ship them. They ship you a bag of composting earthworms, and you open up this little bag, and you turn it upside down, all the earthworms fall out. So yes, I seeded ours. It's not necessary for you to do so, but because while 2 feet of it was organic matter that I had built up over time and I knew the insects were there, that last foot was purchased material, right? So I didn't know what kind of microbes, and I wanted them to be as healthy as possible. So I did seed mine, but so the system that we use for worm composting is called a subpod, SUBPOD. It's on my vendor list, and I will say it previously existed. The company started in Australia, but now they are rebooting themselves in the United States. So it will be easier to get a hold of them, and also they will be manufactured nearby, so you don't have to worry about having as many charges with respect to shipping and carbon tax and so on and so forth. So, yes. Yes?
In your ground coverage, your most and the like, do you have problems? I have problems with non-native weeds coming up in that, thus I don't have monoculture anymore, so I'm forever weeding my mimosa.
So the question is whether or not I end up having to weed the Freedom Lawn or any place that I have ground cover, and the answer is yes, because you are correct. We do get non-natives that come up, sometimes invasives. So I try and keep on top of it. Essentially, in my case, when I'm walking around looking for dog poo, I try and also keep an eye open for a seedling that I recognize as non-native. But quite honestly, we've been very lucky. We have managed to either catch them early enough that they haven't made a massive impact on our Freedom Lawn, or our natives have outcompeted those particular plants. So didn't really have to do that much seeding, but yes. The dog is very useful for bringing in natives and distributing natives, but also for distributing things I don't want in my yard. Any other questions? Yep.
One more, I'm sorry.
Of course, no problem.
I keep asking questions. Why did you let your grass die off? I mean, I'm constantly digging mine out, which I hate with a passion, but I do it for the pickaxe. But how did you let it die off?
So the question was how we let our grass die off, or how to get it to die off.
The county made me put grass in when we built our house.
Yes, and that's a very similar thing. The questioner is asking and stating that when they put their house in, the county made them put in grass. So now you got to take a pickaxe to get it out. I killed my grass because our soil is actually so junky that it can barely support the St. Augustine on it without massive amounts of irrigation, massive amounts of fertilizer, massive amounts of herbicide. So I just stopped. A couple of places I made little hole areas and put in a sunshine mimosa or a frog fruit, and then just left it alone, let it all die off as much as possible.
Once it died off, you didn't dig out the roots, you just let it go.
I just let it go. Because actually, so the question is whether you leave the roots, and in my case, the answer is yes, because here's the thing. Usually when I pull out plants these days, let's say I have to remove something and I want to kill it off, I actually try and cut it off at the soil. Take off, do whatever you want with the stuff that's on top, right? In my case, because I'm lazy, I just let it turn into compost, right? I just let it drop. I'm very much about a chop and drop kind of thing, unless it's something that's invasive and I need to bag it. I just chop it off. And the reason is I want to leave this root system as it is, even if it's an invasive plant, because quite often those root systems are holding in your soil keeping some of your insects a little happy, especially the ones that live in the soil, and allowing certain microbes to grow. So if I take off the part that will reseed itself or expand, but let the roots stay until they break down and something else now comes into its place, all I've done is created more biological matter for my own lawn without having to do any work. So, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you guys so much for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you very
Sounds like
much.
we need a presentation on composting.
Ooh, I would have no problems doing that.
All right, so if you didn't get a handout, grab one. We have tickets out there, and we also have the Marjorie Shropshire book, the step-by-step guidebook out there. If you're interested in purchasing that, we're selling those below cost just to help people get going. Okay, thank you so much for coming, and if you want to hear it again tomorrow, we'll be doing this again tomorrow at 6 p.m.
We are, and also I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So I'll be sticking around for a little bit. And Adam, do you mind? Okay, so I'd like to point out one more person. So this is Adam, who works with Florida Custom Aquatics. He was kind enough to come out and be here. So he is the one who actually planned and designed and put in our stream. He works very closely, in our case, with Change of Greenery and other native plant nurseries, and has managed to create something that is pretty darn amazing, even though we have a small one, right? He creates giant ones that support, you know, ponds and koi and other animals. I think you guys created a pond for ducks, was it? Or was it chickens?
Ducks, we've done ducks, chickens, pigs, goats. One was a farm that had a variety of stuff, but yeah. And all of our water features are natural, so we don't use chlorine or sterilizers. We rely on nature and biology to keep the water healthy and clean. So they support the ecosystems. Incorporating native plants is an awesome way to bring in that wildlife to the water.
But Adam said he'd also be available for any questions you might have, so feel free to go that way. But thank you again so much for listening. I appreciate it.